All right, we're going to continue now with the second lecture on leadership. Again, it'll be the same thing. I'm going to read something to you and explain it from the Political Leadership in Context article. All right, so the whole body of Lenin's work on the question looks as if it were more informed by neo-Hegelian thought on the power of ideas rather than classic materialist determinism characteristic of Marx. Indeed, Lenin's conspectus of Hegel's Science of Logic has this remarkable admission: the thought of the ideal passing into the real is profound, very important for history, but also in the personal life of man. It is clear that this contains much truth. All right, we get into sort of areas where it's more philosophical than practical. I think the importance for political leadership is always in practical context. People do argue out, right, what should be considered and what should not be considered in terms of our understanding of what political approach or what approach we're going to take to political leadership. I think it's best if we think about political leadership, as I've said, in a contextual basis based on personal qualities and also that moment in time. Different leaders, different points in time, as I've pointed out, very important, because if you're going to assess a leader, you have to assess them in that moment. So philosophically, you can say there's these ideas, right, that we sort of mull about and move about as academics and the like, and they're very important. But ultimately, it comes down, we look at and we study leadership in based upon moments in time and particular political leaders. There are similarities, things that we learn that are really important. We can get bogged down in arguments. When I say bogged down, I'm really talking about focusing on things that maybe are interesting and may have some importance, but ultimately are not getting where we want to in this class, which is looking at leadership, looking at those situations and those leaders, and seeing exactly how they dealt with various challenges based on personality, path to the present, those challenges facing them. All of that is very important for understanding contextually what leaders are likely to do in a given environment under a considered political system. In our case, it's democracy, in order to really understand what makes for a more effective leader. And I think that you'll find as we go on that some of those things might be surprising. All right, we can get bogged down again in questions of what are leaders and followers' personal characteristics. What I mean by getting bogged down is we're moving more into modern analysis and political analysis rather than philosophical. We don't want to look at followers. You've got to have followers, but we want to really look at the relationship. Leaders and whether they actually move followers in a given moment to follow them, or whether they, adjust. I think you'll find it interesting that in the cases we're going to look at, it's not really that well planned out. It's more of a reaction in real time to circumstances where sometimes the leaders we're going to look at make decisions that set them back. It's really how they respond to being set back that we really care about. So far as functions that leaders serve in a given situation and context, we really learn, I think, and I can't even say anecdotally because I think these are important examples that carry a great deal of weight that we're going to look at. But how leaders do in certain situations. Is there a consistency? I think one of the problems is situations aren't all the same. There's too many particulars to be able to say that, okay, this kind of situation always comes up. And here's how 5 different leaders dealt with this particular situation. There are broad categories, right? Broad categories of issues that they deal with, economic, in terms of conflict, both militarily and otherwise, social unrest. But the contextual base, the historical and social structure is different in most places. And so we never really have, and this is one of the great challenges in the social sciences, we never really have enough of the same circumstances with the same contextual base to really make any sort of, I think, important and consistent decisions across leadership over time. But we do see similarities structurally in the way that they process information, the impact it has on them, and the way in which they respond to that impact. Okay. So far as motivation, I don't want to be glib, and I don't want to be give too great a generalization. But motivation for most political leaders, contextually, is to have some power and do some good, perhaps, or at least perceived good, during that given moment in time. Some are born to where they feel that, in fact, it's. I'm having trouble with my time. Okay, there we go. Some are born in a moment that really, I think, works well with their personality, and they're able to, I think, realize those ends or their ends because the moment in time is consistent with that, if that makes any sense. In other words, certain leaders are predisposed personally, almost genetically, to certain situations. Others are not in that same situation. So it becomes, I think, a little bit more difficult to, even though you're looking at a leader in that situation. Again, it's difficult to really determine, all right, this is the situation in this context that always happens. It doesn't. And that these are the characteristics of leaders in those situations, and here's how they always sort of work with and make decisions in that about that particular challenge. That's not the case either. So what are we attempting to do? We're attempting to understand sort of the fundamental ideas and reactions that have to take place in a context, in any context, and by leaders. So we're not looking at a particular context. I mean, we could take, for example, let's look at when there's social unrest. Let's look at social unrest only in democracies. Only in a democracy that has been around for 100 years. I mean, you begin to become more specific, and as you become more specific, the application becomes less important. Because the more specific you get, even if you have several different cases of it, those may be unique cases that are not going to crop up again. So this is the world in which social scientists live, as I've said. We live with a lot of moving parts, and so what we try and understand is there a consistency across those moving parts in some way, even though there are a lot of moving parts. Can we learn from it? And the answer is yes, we can learn from it. And we could recognize similar situations with similar personalities and similar reactions and get a more insightful understanding of the reactions that might take place in any given situation. So we can look at all kinds of things, how leaders move history and the like, but I think that it's probably best to look at maybe some structural things and get a better sense of it. Okay, so what are we really trying to look at here? How do we go about assessing these situations? As I said before, there's normative typologies and that sort of thing. But what we have to really, I think, focus on is we have these normative typologies that, as your reading lays out, right? Normative typologies equip us with the important instrument for ethical assessments of leadership in the modern world. Among the classic leadership typologies still current in the West, one of the more popular is Aristotle's normative dualistic typology that distinguishes between self-interested rulers and leaders and common interested rulers and leaders. Aristotle's normative typology of political leadership correlates two variables: the number of rulers on the one hand, and the motivation and end results of their ruling on the other. So the first part of that is pretty clear, right? We talk about the number of rulers. That's reasonably, we're reasonably capable of determining that. Again, it gets contextual. When we say leaders, in how we define a particular leader in a given moment, is it political, is it something else, or what have you? All right, so the idea here is that when we talk about normative, we're assuming that there's a norm, right? regardless of the standard of correctness in behavior or what have you, that there's a norm. We can figure that norm out, and that we're attempting to establish that norm, look at it and establish it, especially if we can come up with rules. We want to know if the normative approach actually gives us some fundamental rules that are consistent. It's interesting. Social scientists are always looking for consistency, obviously, so we learn something. But again, it's not easy, and I think that we begin to sort of break things down to categories and get it to a point where it's very difficult to really assess what might work in a given situation. All right, so let's look at these two meanings of good leadership. You can find this on page 17 in your reading. Good equals effective, and then ethical as well, right? So the goals: balance of realism and risk in vision, efficiency of means to ends, and success in achieving the group's goals. We're going to look at these each. Ethical: values of intentions, goals, quality of means used, good results for in-group and outsiders. All right, so good leadership then should have the goals of being effective, which means balance of realism and risk in vision. So fundamentally what we're talking about is having some leader having some sort of understanding of the moment in time they're in, right? And some way of approaching, bringing about resolution in a way that is effective. The means they use is basically efficiency, right? To the ends that they're trying to succeed. Efficiency is a weird way to sort of describe what we're talking about, because efficiency of means to those ends means there needs to be a logical consistency between the means and the end that you're trying to accomplish. That the straightest, the best and most effective means are those that are almost linear, that move along a linear line. That we can see that executing this works, and we execute effectively, and it does work. Obviously, the consequences is there's a success in achieving the group's goals. If you're leading a group, there are goals. And achieving those goals are important. Now, the assumption here is that the goals in a group those goals are really representative of that group across moments in time during which we're trying to affect a policy that will address a particular issue. In other words, success, in achieving a group's goals means the goals are pretty consistent, probably usually broad, and that the way in which we go about, satisfying those goals is going to be, effective. We're going to actually, some means of efficiency will get us there. On the ethical side, values of intentions and, again, in those goals, the value is difficult to come to. We might be able to say that values like freedom, if we could define that, those values are important because the society is based upon freedom. Let's say freedom of expression, that's an important one. So we look at that and we say, okay, we can build anything that moves us towards a more equitable society in terms of our being able to, attain those values and successfully would be something worth our efforts in going after. Now, the means, always it's about, when we talk about ethical, the quality of the means. Look, ethics are, I hate to keep saying things are difficult to define, but ethical behavior is one that should be consistent with the morals and the accepted means in the society. Acting in a way that's consistent with those, one would consider ethical. And finally, in terms of consequences, good results for in-group and outsiders. That you go beyond those that are just in your group, with the impact, generally speaking. So these are normative in structure. There are also empirical typologies. Empirical typologies, as an approach, refocuses the researcher's attention on the observable functions of leadership, the personal qualities of a leader, or the sources of a leader's authority, rather than assessing leadership from the sublime perspective of terminal values. Empirical typologies seek to situate the problem within a context of individual and social psychology, group interactions, and social structures and institutions. Leadership, according to Weber, is exercised according to traditional, legal, rational, or charismatic domination, authority, and legitimation. Weber's typology of the most common motives of leadership in pre-modern and modern societies emphasizes leaders' embeddedness in society and helps solve research tasks of comparative nature. Okay, embeddedness in society is what I'm curious about and exploring a bit here. Those that drive leadership in the pre-modern and modern societies emphasize leaders' embeddedness in society. When we say embeddedness, it means a connection to and a consequence of that particular society. In other words, leadership, it's difficult to move a population unless in some way you are tied to that population. You can connect to that population or convince them that they should be moving with you. So one way to look at it is in that way. So Weber's typology of legitimate power and authority, this is on page 18, is important for us just to get our mind around. So this is a particular approach or assessment of the different typologies that is important to sort of be familiar with. So the type of legitimate power and authority: traditional, rational, legal, and charismatic. I would argue that charismatic is very important across the board, regardless of the type of political structure you're in. And so, all right, traditional, the source of legitimate power in a traditional legislative power and authority relationship is just custom and the institutions that are in place. That's traditional, right? Here's how we do things, and this is the way we've always done them, and this is the way we're going to continue to do them. Then there's the rational and legal, and here again, now you get legal and bureaucratic procedures. That one type of legitimate power comes from just being part of a rational legal structure that's responsible for just procedures, in carrying out the will of the leadership. Then it's charismatic, personal qualities, extraordinary gifts of the leader. I think this is the most important. Most people are not motivated to follow a bureaucrat, but they are motivated to follow someone who is charismatic. And in the United States, there have been any number of charismatic leaders. While it's hard to define what charisma is, it's not something that I think you can make the argument that it's not something you can learn, that it exists or it doesn't exist. When you feign that, I think it's pretty obvious that this is not comfortable for you. Charismatic leadership usually does a couple of things. One, it puts people at ease. In order to be able to receive someone's personality, if you will, you need to be at ease. You can't feel threatened. You can't feel uncertain. So charismatic is important for putting people at ease so they're open to the ideas. The second thing about it is that it has to be enjoyable. In other words, people feel safe in that environment, and your way of expressing things, storytelling is a big one, as you'll see, is something people can latch on to. They can understand. They're not confused by. You can't be charismatic and no one knows what you're talking about because it's just too complicated. I mean, it's very hard to be charismatic in an effective way if that's actually the situation. So these personal qualities are important. Usually in the ability to speak, usually in the way you speak, and the way in which you can communicate. A lot of, when you think about our political leaders that have been charismatic, they can really move crowds. I'm not really concerned with, for good or ill, just that they can move people, followers, to want to spend time with them. And that's probably the easiest way to measure the level of charisma or the charismatic nature of a leader is, do people want to spend time in their presence? Is it enjoyable? If it is, you're open to it. And if they're talking about, in the case of political leadership, solving problems, even if there's no way to be certain that the way in which they're going to attempt to solve a problem is in fact something that they can accomplish, it doesn't really matter necessarily. It's a belief. It's a desire to want to be part of that solution because of the person leading you. All right. Then another way we have to look at this is the strong versus weak leaders. Again, it's definitional, right? So you get strong leaders, and what are their personal qualities? They're strong, they're decisive personalities. That doesn't mean that they're charismatic, right? So you get someone that is in a leadership role, right? And they can find a way, whatever way you might want to look at this, to lead. Sometimes it's the population's in a situation, like say England was during World War II, where knowing that someone is confident, puts people at ease, and also makes them feel like they're effectively moving towards an end that they all want. Whereas weak leadership seems to be indecisive and an indecisive personality. What's interesting there is it's really how firm you are, the leader is, in determining what road to take. If they seem convinced and they seem, as if there's no other choices, if they come across that way, that this is what we must do, people are willing to follow for a while. Again, they've got to see some results. They can't just follow blindly and hope for the best. But decisiveness is important in a leader. Sort of vacillating, equivocating is not good, because people come to leaders for certainty, right? If you can't be certain, then you can't lead. In order to lead, you need to be able to lead to some place, some policy decision, or what have you. And if people feel you're uncertain about that, they're uncertain about it. That's one of the important qualities about a leader. There's got to be a level of certainty that you can convey to people about this is the right road to take and this is the road we need to take. Yet the best leaders, those that are most effective in reaching their policy ends, often are able, when they make a mistake, to change course. But people are also willing to trust that, because they believe that an adjustment is necessary, especially if the leader can convince them that this was an important change because other things change. It's just an important change in order for to reach your end. Now, this seems very simple. We've broken it down in these categories, but there's a mix of these, right? You can have someone that is charismatic, but has an entrepreneurship element. We're going to take it here. It's never been there before. It's oftentimes, I like to use the example of JFK saying we were going to land on the moon by the end of the decade. You put it far enough in the future, you're not going to be around in a political leadership, I don't mean in terms of living, where you're going to be held accountable for that, because it's happened way after you've sort of left office. But there, what you have is someone saying, a president saying, because we were failing in terms of our race in outer space with the Russians, with the Soviet Union, and that looked bad for us. We tried to get rockets up; they would come off the ground for a certain distance and then fall back down. So we were not seen as a leader, and we needed to be seen that way. So JFK said, we're going to land on the moon. And lo and behold, we did. Now, we didn't have any means of knowing how to do that. There were, no means were in place. But the leadership quality of saying we're going to go there, the certainty of it, allows people to begin to believe that it's possible, and then to pursue avenues and deviate from them as need be, that will get us there. And eventually you get there. And if you get there because the political leader says you're going to get there, and then we actually do, all of a sudden, the world was watching as we landed on the moon. It doesn't matter that there was nothing discernible we could say about that experience. Like, oh, we found this, and it's clear and it's discernible, and we don't need to go back. But the idea that we were able to do it, to land on the moon, was very impressive and put us obviously at the forefront of that particular challenge. All right, so there are a few things I want to make sure you're clear on. One is that these typologies seem to be realistic because we tend to think, especially in matters we don't understand at the beginning, in a binary fashion. It's weak, it's strong. It's a charismatic leader or it's not. I mean, there could be I'm not going to pronounce that word, charismatic leader, right, in a given circumstance, but not in another. It's a measure of maybe their comfortability. So that's important to understand. This is not, an all or nothing proposition. It's not this is the way it is, or it's not this at all. That's not the way this works. Leadership is an interesting concept, right? You would think in order to lead, there's got to be something that people want that you believe you can deliver, which means that you have to know what that thing is in that moment in time, and you have to figure out a way to deliver some sort of solution, resolution, or what have you to that particular issue. Remember, policy is nothing more than a way of dealing with an issue that has come up. The way you solve those, or at least approach them, is to create policy. Those policies are supposed to address that particular issue, and if not resolve it, at least be able to manage it, right? That's the goal. So for leaders, political leaders, remember, they get into a political position of some sort because of a series of events, whether it's structural, like you have to run for office and get nominated or what have you, or not. Political leadership is responsible for dealing with policy, right? That's the thing. How we're going to solve problems, or how we're going to address problems, or how we're going to mitigate problems of all sorts. The idea is that if you've got a democracy or a republic, that the people's concerns are supposed to be addressed in any given context. If you're talking about another type of regime or what have you, that's not the purpose. The purpose is not necessarily to meet the needs of the people, but do what's best for the people. A republic doesn't address issues that way, that we're going to do what we think is best. We're going to find out what the public wants, and then either we're going to do what the public wants, or we're going to try and persuade the public that that's not the best course of action. But there is some give and take between the public and those in the leadership position. If you have a dictatorship, obviously the concern is the dictator being able to maintain their power and hopefully grow it, so they control resources and that sort of thing. Now, what's interesting is people often think of dictators as being corrupt because they grab resources at the expense of the people. Well, that's not unique necessarily to dictatorships. You can get that happening in all kinds of political structures. Why? Because human beings, are involved in those structures, and human beings, as I said in the first lecture, suffer from, fear and greed and a whole host of issues that are always present. It's not unique to any type of political structure. So when we think about, political leadership, I want to think about a few things. It's context-based. It's based on the leader-follower relationship, right? It's based on the social structure. It's based on the political structure, bureaucracy, and so on. And it's based on effectiveness. Failure is never good for a political leader. Now, some failures are large, and there's no way around those, and that's really problematic. And some you can tweak, and okay, we'll go down a different road. So it's not all the same. Okay, so as you read the article, keep in mind context, keep in mind the relationship between different leaders in a moment in time. But the idea here is to give you a framework. I'm not saying it's a framework that gives you answers to everything, but that it's a framework against which we can sort of thrust our curiosity and our desire to understand the political leaders we're going to look at and how they dealt with certain situations. And I think what you'll see is that some of this comes to life with that. And at the end, you should understand the relationships we've talked about here, but also understand that these are an ironclad sort of, look it up in a dictionary solution or a book, that they require a certain amount of understanding and an ability to move your focus based upon the moment in time the total context. All right, and so we'll pick it up looking at those leaders next time.